Lieutenant Richard Bong's P-38 Lightning shook violently as 20mm cannon shells ripped through its left engine cowling. 18,000 feet above the Solomon Islands, he was alone, his wingmen already spiraling toward the Pacific Ocean, trailing a thick column of smoke. The August 1943 sun blazed through the canopy as Bong threw his twin-boom fighter into another desperate, banking turn. But the Japanese Zero behind him matched the maneuver effortlessly, closing in with deadly precision. Bong had been trained at the best fighter schools in America. He knew every defensive tactic in the manual: barrel rolls, split S's, chandelles, scissors maneuvers. He had tried them all in the last 90 seconds, and the Zero pilot had countered every one with unnerving ease. Now the enemy fighter was less than 200 yards behind him, perfectly positioned on his 6 o'clock. The Japanese guns were lined up for the kill shot that would send Bong after his wingman into the sea. His instrument panel glowed with warning lights, oil pressure dropping in the damaged engine, airspeed bleeding off as he struggled to keep the nose up, altitude unwinding as gravity and battle damage conspired against him. In perhaps 10 more seconds, the Zero would finish the job, and Richard Bong would become another statistic in the brutal arithmetic of Pacific air combat. Then, with death staring him in the face and no options left in the pilot's playbook, Bong did something every instructor had warned would kill him instantly. He rolled the P-38 completely inverted, wheels pointing skyward, and shoved the control stick violently forward. The Lightning's nose dropped toward the ocean in a screaming vertical dive. But Bong wasn't diving in the normal sense. He was plunging upside down, blood rushing to his head so fast his vision turned crimson, the instrument panel dissolving into a red blur. For 2 seconds that felt like eternity, Richard Bong flew blind through negative G-forces no manual said his aircraft could withstand. The P-38's twin Allison engines shrieked in protest. Loose tools and spent shell casings floated off the cockpit floor and smacked against the canopy above his head. His oxygen mask felt like it was tearing off his face. Every blood vessel in his eyes threatened to burst. When he finally rolled upright at 12,000 feet, having plunged 6,000 feet in those 2 terrifying seconds, the Zero was gone. Not behind him, not anywhere. Gone completely, as though it had vanished into thin air. Bong circled cautiously, scanning every quadrant of sky, but there was nothing. The Japanese fighter that had been seconds from killing him had simply disappeared. Gasping for breath and wiping blood from his eyes, he didn't yet realize that he had just stumbled upon a maneuver that would change the entire Pacific Air War. A desperate, seemingly suicidal trick that would shatter the Zero's dominance and help turn the tide. Within months, what began as one terrified pilot's instinctive move would spread as whispered wisdom across every Allied airfield, from Guadalcanal to the Philippines. This is the story of how American pilots learned to fly upside down to survive, and how that discovery transformed the most deadly aircraft in the Pacific from an unstoppable hunter into prey. It's the story of innovation born from desperation, and how the laws of physics proved stronger than the most agile fighter ever built. To understand why Bong's accidental discovery was so revolutionary, you first have to understand how completely the Japanese Zero ruled the Pacific skies in 1942 and early 1943. When American pilots first encountered the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, they could hardly believe what they were seeing. This Japanese fighter defied every assumption U.S. intelligence had made about enemy capabilities. The Zero could outturn any Allied fighter with ease. It climbed faster, flew farther, and reached higher altitudes than anything the Americans fielded. In the early battles over the Philippines, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies, Zero pilots achieved kill ratios that seemed impossible. 3 Allied losses for every Japanese aircraft destroyed. In some fights, it was even worse. The aircraft itself was a masterpiece of lightweight engineering. Designer Jiro Horikoshi created a fighter that weighed only 3,700 pounds empty, compared with over 5,000 for American aircraft like the P-40 Warhawk. That weight savings came through radical choices: No armor plating to protect the pilot, unprotected fuel tanks without self-sealing linings, and an airframe built to minimal stress tolerances, trading durability for maneuverability. In performance, those sacrifices made the Zero almost supernatural. It could complete a 360-degree turn in just under 16 seconds at combat speed. An American P-40 needed 23 seconds. 7 seconds may sound small, but in a dogfight it was an eternity. Long enough for the Zero to loop inside its opponent's turn and end up on the American's tail, guns ready for the kill. Before we continue, let me know where you're watching from and whether you'd heard this story before. If you enjoy deep dives into World War II history, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. These stories take serious research to tell right, and knowing you're out there makes it worth it. American pilots were dying by the dozens because they fought the Zero on its own terms. In 1942, fighter tactics were still shaped by World War I dogfighting doctrine. Pilots were taught to turn, to get inside the opponent's circle, to outmaneuver until they could bring their guns to bear. That worked in Europe against heavier German fighters, but in the Pacific, it was suicide. Lieutenant Commander John Tatch, one of the U.S. Navy's most inventive tacticians, watched his men lose again and again in training exercises against captured Zeros. He became obsessed with finding an answer. He spent weeks studying the Zero's performance and realized something vital. Yes, the Japanese fighter could turn tighter than anything in the American inventory. Yes, it could climb faster. But that incredible agility came at a price. Its ultra-lightweight design introduced weaknesses that could be exploited if U.S. pilots stopped trying to outturn it. American fighters possessed strengths the Zero simply could not match. Aircraft like the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the F-4U Corsair had far more powerful engines, giving them superior speed both in level flight and especially in dives. Their rugged construction could absorb punishment that would rip a Zero to pieces. Their fuel systems were designed to handle violent maneuvering without starving the engines. And, crucially, their pilots were shielded by armor plating and reinforced cockpits, protection the Zero entirely lacked. From these insights, Lieutenant Commander John Thatch developed what became known as the Thatch Weave, a coordinated defensive maneuver where two American fighters would crisscross in flight, covering each other's tails and forcing enemy pilots into the crossfire. It worked and saved countless lives, but it was a purely defensive tactic. It kept pilots alive. It didn't teach them how to win. Defeating the Zero still required something new, something no manual or training program could provide. That breakthrough came from desperation, not planning. The encounter that changed everything happened on April 7, 1943, over the Russell Islands in the Solomon Chain. Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron, flying a P-38 Lightning, found himself in the kind of situation that had killed dozens of American pilots before him. 8 Japanese Zeros ambushed his flight from above. In the chaos of the merge, Lynch was separated from his wingmen. Alone at 20,000 feet with multiple Zeros maneuvering onto his tail, he knew he couldn't outturn them. His Lightning was faster, but the Zeros had the altitude advantage, and running straight and level would only give them an easy shot. Every evasive move he knew required turning, exactly what the Zeros excelled at. So Lynch made a split-second decision that most would have called insane. He rolled his P-38 completely inverted and shoved the control stick forward, initiating a nose-down dive while flying upside down. The world flipped, ocean above, sky below, as the Lightning, built like an armored tank compared to the fragile Zero, plunged toward the sea. Lynch's vision went red under the crushing negative G-forces. Then came the revelation. The Zeros didn't follow. When their pilots tried to roll inverted and push into the same dive, the aircraft shuddered and warped under the strain. Worse, their carbureted engines weren't designed to handle negative Gs. The fuel flow cut off instantly. Some Zero engines sputtered, others quit completely, leaving their pilots gliding helplessly as Lynch's P-38 screamed away at ever-increasing speed. Lynch didn't just survive, he turned the tables. At 12,000 feet, he rolled upright, pulled back hard on the stick, and shot upward. Now the Zeros were below him, scattered and slow. The hunter had become the hunted. Diving from above, Lynch's 6 50 caliber machine guns locked onto a Zero that never saw him coming. It disintegrated under his fire. When Lynch returned to base, his face was speckled with tiny red dots, burst blood vessels from the negative Gs. His eyes were bloodshot, his head pounding, but he was alive, and he knew he had discovered something extraordinary. That night, over drinks in the pilot's tent, he described the maneuver to his fellow airmen. The younger pilots listened, half in disbelief. Flying inverted was dangerous. Diving inverted was suicidal, or so they'd always been told. But Lynch was standing there, alive, with 2 confirmed kills to his name, insisting that the Zeros physically could not follow M through the maneuver. The physics behind his discovery were simple once understood. In normal flight, gravity pulls the pilot downward with 1 G of force. During a standard dive, pulling the stick back creates positive Gs, pressing the pilot into the seat. Pilots trained rigorously to handle these forces, sometimes reaching 7 or 8 Gs in combat turns. But an inverted dive generated negative Gs, pushing the pilot upward and forcing the blood into the head instead of the legs. Even a few seconds of negative Gs could burst capillaries in the eyes and face, cause blinding headaches, and lead to blackout. It was painful, disorienting, and exhausting, but the human body could endure it briefly. Aircraft fuel systems, however, could not. The Zero's carburetor relied on gravity-fed fuel flow from tanks above the engine. When the aircraft went inverted, gravity pulled the fuel away from the intake instead of toward it. The engine sputtered, coughed, and often died altogether. A Zero pilot attempting an inverted dive suddenly found himself in a powerless glider while his American opponent roared away at ever-increasing speed. U.S. fighters like the P-38 and later versions of the P-47 and Corsair used fuel injection systems instead of carburetors. That meant fuel was pumped directly to the engine regardless of the plane's orientation. A Lightning could fly upside down indefinitely without losing power. This seemingly minor engineering difference became a life-and-death advantage in combat. The new tactic spread through American squadrons not through official channels, but through word of mouth, the underground network of fighter pilot lore that always outpaces formal instruction. Pilots swapped the story in briefing tents and mess halls, passing it along to rookies about to fly their first missions. If a Zero gets on your tail, don't turn. Roll inverted and dive. He can't follow. It went by many names: the split S when executed from altitude, the inverted escape when used defensively, and the negative G dive in formal debriefs. But among the pilots themselves, it was simply called going upside down on them. And by mid-1943, it had become the first piece of advice every veteran gave to new arrivals fresh from stateside training. Official manuals still warned against inverted flight as too dangerous and disorienting, but in the Pacific, it was becoming standard practice, and it was saving lives. Lieutenant de Haven of the 7th Fighter Squadron scored his first victory using the inverted dive in July 1943. During a bomber escort mission near New Georgia, a Japanese Zero slipped onto his tail. De Haven rolled his P-38 inverted, pushed into the dive, and glanced at his rearview mirror just in time to see the Zero's engine sputter and die as it tried to follow him. Recovering at 8,000 feet, de Haven climbed back up and found the Japanese fighter still struggling to restart its engine. He lined it up in his sights and fired. It was the easiest kill of his career. He would go on to use that same tactic to claim 13 more victories before the war ended. The physical effects of the maneuver were brutal but survivable. Flight surgeons stationed on Guadalcanal began collecting medical data from pilots who regularly performed inverted dives, and their findings were both fascinating and alarming. Nearly every pilot reported burst blood vessels in the eyes and face, leaving them with blood-red sclera and blotched skin. Headaches lasting hours or even days were nearly universal. Some experienced temporary vision loss. A few blacked out entirely during the most extreme negative G dives. But none of that mattered, because the alternative was death. Pilots joked grimly that they'd rather come back with red eyes and a migraine than receive a posthumous medal. The medical staff documented these effects, but never discouraged the maneuver. They understood what every pilot knew. Against the Zero, every edge mattered. A few burst capillaries were a small price to pay for survival. What made the inverted dive so devastating was the way it flipped the entire tactical situation on its head, literally. Before this discovery, a Zero on an American fighter's tail was almost a death sentence. The American pilot's options were limited, his life expectancy measured in seconds. But once pilots mastered the inverted dive, that equation changed. Now, when a Zero latched on to an American 6, the U.S. pilot would roll inverted and dive. The Zero couldn't follow, and within seconds, the American was diving below with a huge speed advantage. Pulling out of the dive, he could climb back up into the sun and attack from above, where the Zero was most vulnerable. Japanese pilots were completely unprepared for this tactical revolution. Their entire air combat doctrine was built around turning fights, exploiting the Zero's unmatched maneuverability to outcircle opponents. They had been taught that American fighters were slow, heavy, and unrefined, that once you got into a turning engagement, victory was guaranteed. None of their training covered what to do when an American fighter suddenly rolled upside down and plunged away in a dive that their aircraft physically couldn't follow. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most celebrated aces, later wrote about the first time he encountered this new tactic. He described moving carefully into position behind a P-38, certain of an easy kill, only to watch in disbelief as the American rolled inverted and dived straight toward the ocean. When Sakai tried to imitate the move, his Zero's engine sputtered and quit, forcing him to abandon the attack while his target escaped. What frustrated Sakai even more was what came next. The same P-38 climbed back up minutes later and attacked from above, using the altitude and speed it had gained in the dive. In an instant, the roles had reversed. The hunter had become the hunted, and there was nothing the Zero pilots could do about it except try to avoid tail chase engagements altogether. By late 1943, the inverted dive had evolved from an improvised survival trick into an established combat doctrine. American squadron leaders were now openly teaching it, even though official training manuals still warned against inverted flight. Colonel Neil Kirby of the 475th Fighter Group told his pilots bluntly during pre-mission briefings, "If you try to turn with a Zero, you die. If you try to climb with a Zero, you die. Roll inverted, dive, use your speed, and attack from above. That's how you survive. That's how you win." The P-38 Lightning, with its unique twin-boom design, was particularly suited to the maneuver. Its robust structure could withstand the violent negative G forces, and its power allowed it to convert the dive's energy into a blistering zoom climb afterward. Japanese pilots quickly learned to fear the Lightning silhouette. The moment they saw those twin booms, they knew a trap might be waiting. P-38 pilots leaned into this fear. They began deliberately baiting Zeros into tail chase situations, rolling inverted at the perfect moment and diving away, then circling back as the Japanese fighters stalled or lost power. The once predatory Zeros were now the prey. Captain Thomas Maguire, who would eventually become the second highest scoring American ace of the war, with 38 victories, used the inverted dive to devastating effect over the Philippines in 1944. The tactic that had begun as a desperate gamble by a handful of outnumbered pilots had evolved into an established combat doctrine, a simple, brutal lesson written in blood and physics. When your enemy's strength is turning, you win by doing what he cannot do: fly upside down and dive straight through the impossible. In one engagement over Leyte Gulf, Captain Thomas Maguire deliberately slowed his P-38 to tempt a Japanese Zero into closing for the kill. When the enemy pilot took the bait and moved into firing range, Maguire rolled the Lightning inverted and plunged into a steep dive. The Zero tried to follow, but the stress of the negative G forces tore it apart mid-air. Its wings folded upward, the fragile airframe buckled, and the fighter disintegrated before it ever reached the ocean. Maguire hadn't even fired a shot. The same principle worked across different American aircraft, though each required its own refinement of technique. The F-4U Corsair, powered by its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, could perform even more violent inverted dives than the P-38. Corsair pilots learned to simply roll upside down and let gravity and raw horsepower drag them downward in screaming vertical plunges no Zero could hope to follow. Marine pilots flying Corsairs from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal used the tactic to devastating effect, racking up kill ratios once thought impossible against the Japanese fighters that had previously seemed unbeatable. The P-47 Thunderbolt, nicknamed the Jug for its bulky fuselage, was the heaviest of the American single-engine fighters. Its weight was a disadvantage in a turning fight, but a decisive advantage in diving combat. P-47 pilots could roll inverted and descend so fast they approached the speed of sound, reaching velocities where the aircraft's controls grew heavy and unstable. But Japanese aircraft couldn't match those speeds, and Thunderbolt pilots exploited their superior weight and ruggedness mercilessly. By 1944, the air war in the Pacific had completely reversed. Kill ratios that once favored Japan now overwhelmingly tilted toward the United States. For every American fighter lost, 3, 4, or even 5 Japanese aircraft were being destroyed. The Zero, once the undisputed master of the Pacific skies, had become a liability. The same design features that made it nimble and deadly early in the war now made it fragile, underpowered, and fatally outmatched. Japanese engineers scrambled to respond. They developed newer fighters such as the J-2M Raiden and the K-84 Hayate, with stronger engines, sturdier frames, and improved high-speed handling. But these designs arrived too late and in too few numbers to change the outcome. Even the improved models couldn't sustain engine power through negative G maneuvers, nor could they match the diving speeds of American aircraft. The physics that made the inverted dive effective couldn't be engineered away fast enough to matter. Meanwhile, Japan's most irreplaceable resource, its veteran pilots, was being annihilated. The aces who had dominated the skies in 1942 were gone, lost over the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Philippines. Their replacements were often barely trained, sometimes logging fewer than 100 total flight hours before being thrown into combat against seasoned American veterans. These inexperienced pilots had no chance against U.S. aviators who understood their aircraft's strengths and weaknesses intimately. Richard Bong, the man whose desperate, accidental maneuver had started it all, went on to become America's top-scoring ace with 40 confirmed kills. He refined the inverted dive into an art form, sometimes deliberately baiting Japanese pilots into chasing him just so he could demonstrate its effectiveness. Fellow pilots would later watch his gun camera footage in awe as Bong calmly rolled inverted, plunged away from pursuing Zeros, then climbed back up to destroy them from above. The maneuver's usefulness extended far beyond fighter versus fighter combat. American bomber crews soon adapted partial versions of the inverted dive to shake off attackers. A fully loaded bomber couldn't withstand the violent negative G stresses of a true inversion, but by rolling partially inverted and diving steeply, bomber pilots could still break an enemy fighter's attack lock long enough for their gunners to retarget. Many bomber crews credited this trick with saving their lives when swarmed by Japanese interceptors. The psychological impact of the inverted dive on Japanese pilots was as profound as its tactical effect. Air combat is as much mechanical as mechanical, and confidence can decide the outcome long before bullets fly. In early 1943, Japanese aviators were supremely confident, secure in their belief that the Zero could outturn and outclimb anything the Americans fielded. By the end of that same year, that confidence was gone. They knew that even when they gained a position of advantage, their prey might simply roll inverted and vanish downward, only to return seconds later from above with superior speed and altitude. The psychological edge had shifted permanently to the Americans. The influence of the inverted dive reached far beyond World War II. After the war, tactical analysts studied what had worked in the Pacific and codified those lessons into new training doctrines. The Split S, essentially a formalized high-altitude version of the inverted dive, became a core element of post-war fighter instruction. Jet pilots in Korea used variations of the tactic against the MiG-15. In Vietnam, American pilots facing agile Soviet-built fighters rediscovered the same truth that had saved Bong and Lynch decades earlier. Success came from controlling speed and altitude, not from trying to outturn the enemy. The Navy's Fighter Weapons School, better known as Top Gun, founded in 1969, was created to teach pilots exactly these lessons. Use your aircraft's strengths, never fight on your opponent's terms, and exploit energy and speed to dominate the engagement. The principles forged in the skies over the Solomon Islands in 1943 were still being taught to F-14 and FA-18 pilots decades later. Thomas Lynch, the pilot who had transformed Bong's accidental discovery into a deliberate combat tactic, didn't live to see that legacy. He was killed over the Philippines in March 1944, not in a dogfight, but by anti-aircraft fire while strafing Japanese positions at low altitude. He was 27 years old. The inverted dive couldn't protect him from ground fire, and he died practicing the same philosophy he had instilled in his men. Attack aggressively, take calculated risks, and never let the enemy recover. His Medal of Honor citation credited him with 12 confirmed victories and praised his innovative tactical leadership. More than that, his legacy embodied a larger truth about warfare itself, that innovation, adaptability, and courage born from desperation often matter more than technology or numbers. The inverted dive was never just a maneuver. It was a symbol of how human ingenuity, refusing to accept defeat, can rewrite the rules of battle. It wasn't the result of careful planning by generals or of visionary engineering in a design bureau. It was discovered by accident, by a desperate young pilot doing the one thing everyone told him would kill him. It was refined through trial and error by men who had to learn fast or die trying. And it spread not through official orders, but through the whispered, improvised network of those who faced the same deadly challenge day after day. And it worked because it took advantage of something that couldn't be engineered away: the fundamental laws of physics. The story of the inverted dive also shows how razor-thin the line between victory and defeat can be in aerial combat. The Japanese Zero was a masterpiece of design, fast, agile, and lethal in the hands of a skilled pilot. But it wasn't invincible. Its brilliance hid a vulnerability that only revealed itself when an opponent stopped fighting the way everyone said they should. For more than a year, American pilots died by the hundreds trying to crack the puzzle. Then, in August 1943, Richard Bong rolled his P-38 Lightning inverted in a moment of sheer panic, dove away from certain death, and accidentally solved it. The Zero hadn't changed. American aircraft hadn't changed. But the tactics had, and that made all the difference. Today, a restored P-38 Lightning sits in the National Museum of World War II Aviation in Colorado Springs. Painted in the colors of Bong's aircraft, it still bears the name Marge after his fiancée. Beside it, a placard explains the inverted dive and how that single maneuver helped turn the tide of the Pacific Air War. Visitors stand before that elegant twin-boom fighter and imagine what it must have taken to flip it upside down 18,000 feet above the Pacific and dive toward the sea, defying every rule of flying and every instinct for survival. The Japanese Zero fighters that once ruled those skies now sit in museums too, beautiful relics of an age when speed and agility reigned supreme. Standing beside one, you can see exactly why Allied pilots once feared it. The sleek lines, the graceful wings, the lethal simplicity of its design. But you can also see its fragility, the thin aluminum skin, the lightweight frame, the absence of armor. And with the hindsight of history, you understand why this magnificent aircraft couldn't follow American fighters through the inverted dive that shattered its dominance. The lesson of the inverted dive extends far beyond aviation. Sometimes the solution to an impossible problem doesn't come from superior technology or greater resources, but from someone desperate enough to try the thing everyone else insists won't work. Richard Bong wasn't supposed to survive that August day in 1943. He broke every rule, violated every procedure, and lived. In doing so, he handed American pilots the key to defeating an enemy that had seemed unbeatable. The story reminds us that in war, in innovation, and in competition of any kind, success doesn't always go to those with the best tools. It goes to those who figure out how to use what they have most effectively. The Zero remained the better dogfighter until the war's end, but American pilots learned not to dogfight. They learned to roll inverted, dive away, and let physics be their ally. They learned to fight on their own terms, not their enemies. That lesson, born from desperation over the Solomon Islands, remains timeless wherever adversaries are evenly matched. Richard Bong survived the Pacific War as America's highest-scoring ace, but he didn't live to see the peace he helped win. On August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima, Bong was killed testing the new P-80 jet fighter in California. He was 24 years old. The timing was a cruel irony. The man whose courage helped secure victory in the Pacific died on the day that ensured the war would finally end. He never saw the full reach of what his desperate act in 1943 had accomplished. But his legacy lived on, in the hundreds of pilots who survived because they learned to fly upside down when they had to, and in the restored P-38s that still thunder through air shows today, sometimes performing the same split-S maneuver he pioneered, and in every modern fighter training program that still teaches his lesson: use your strengths, avoid your enemy's strengths, and never be afraid to do what seems impossible if it might save your life. The inverted dive, born from terror and desperation, became a piece of timeless tactical wisdom that outlived every pilot who fought in the war that created it. The Zero was unstoppable until one American pilot dared to try something no one else would. His discovery wasn't a new weapon or a better plane. It was simply the courage to fly upside down when everything said it would kill him. Sometimes that's all it takes to change history. One person desperate enough to attempt the impossible and lucky enough to survive.